I'm very happy to have all of you here. And we have a guest who graduated. If you look over, Maria, you wave to everybody. Introduce yourself. Tell them where you're from and that you just graduated.
Happy to. Hi everyone, I'm Maria. I'm from Argentina. I finished in December my master's in communications. So now I'm in the process of beginning my OPT. So I did my master's was in integrated marketing communications. So I'm happy to be done.
Well, it's very nice to have you here. Thank you for coming back to visit. And of course, you all know Dr. Janbeck, and she's already spent some time with you this evening. I am so happy to introduce you to a very special guest that we have tonight. When I was getting my first master's degree at Boston University in the College of Communication, he was my professor. And I thought, oh, this man is so brilliant. I learned so much from him. He's a great teacher. He's been at Boston University for over 50 years. And he teaches primarily in the graduate program, and he teaches over in London at the London program for BU, which is for our graduate students, which I also went to, yes, and one of the founders of the London program for BU. And many of the students that have gone through that program have had a great experience. But in addition to being a great teacher, he's a world-renowned scholar in public relations and in crisis communication, and also international corporate communication and management. And we're very, very fortunate to have him come here to spend time with us tonight to talk about the chapter from his book, which he has shared with you, which you all had to read for tonight. He's going to talk for about an hour, and then after he talks, Professor Janbeck is going to go through the case that's at the end of the chapter for you. But Professor Lerbinger said that he would be happy to stay and comment on any of the issues that might arise in the case. Now, I have one other great announcement. You're all going to be happy to hear this. The schedule is not out for the fall yet. I'm working on it. And Dr. Lerbinger has just agreed to teach one of the hybrid courses for us in the fall. So he can be your professor in the fall if you look. International Corporate Communication. So when the schedule comes out, look for his name and look for that course. And he'll be very, very, I'm sure, very interesting for all of you who will be enrolled in the course. Not only did he spend 50 years at Boston University, but he's also done consulting work all over the world. He's been to China, he's been to Europe, and he's also been to the Middle East. He may have shown some of you some photographs from when he consulted in Bahrain. He's very well known in this field. The course that we teach in crisis communication, we use his textbook. Maria, you had that course and you used his textbook.
Yeah, I usually rent books, but that one I bought it, and at the end of the semester I was like so lucky that I didn't rent the book, and I was like, this is one of the books that I love best.
So one of the ones she didn't return.
I read books and I returned them at the end of the semester, but this one I bought it.
It's a very valuable book, and for those of you taking public relations as your concentration, you will have to take the PR course in crisis management, and we will be using Dr. Lerbinger's text. But I'm taking too much of my time. Thank you so much for coming tonight. We're very happy to have you here.
I want to reply in one sense. Because of the course that I taught here, I was able to complete a book which was published in January. It's called The Global Manager, and it's more of a management-oriented book, and it was published not by a communications editor, but by a business editor. And this also says something that's related to my talk tonight, that I feel that public relations is not just a communications field. Although the Public Relations Society of America somehow doesn't like to say that PR people are involved in managing anything, because they're so sensitive to being accused of manipulating people and public opinion. So they avoid the word management, even though in the chapter I referred to an early definition of public relations where Denny Griswold, who was the editor of a newsletter, which still exists, PR News, started out by saying public relations is a management function. I don't see anything wrong with that. Now, you can go on then and say specializing, and this is what PRSA says. It doesn't use the word specializing. They say public relations is a communications function, is a strategic communications function dealing with, and wait, I didn't put that right. It deals with strategic communications between an organization and its publics. Now, PR people still stick to the word publics, even though if you look at a management book and you go to the index and you look for where is PR, first of all, sometimes it doesn't appear. And when it does appear, it says publicity. Or it may even add corporate image. I don't want PR to be known only for publicity and for corporate image. I want it to be known for the contribution it makes to management thinking. And that's why I'm jumping ahead here in the chapter you read. I think talking about corporate governance is very important because public relations has to make a contribution to the policies of any organization. And then it can communicate it strategically. And the word strategic, incidentally, what does that really mean? Strategic communications. In my lexicon, it means that you are aware of the goals of the organization, the objectives of the organization. We never have to lose sight of that. And so when you communicate strategically, you're saying something that will let people know more about matters that pertain to the mission of the organization. That's another way, the word mission, I think that's PR people are more likely to use that rather than to talk about the goals of an organization. Although, if anybody ever heard of Peter Drucker, he's dead now, but he's known as a management guru. And he's the one who said, well, there are really three goals of a corporation. One is to make profit, make money. Secondly, it's to grow. And third, it's to survive. Because you look down on lists, Fortune magazine lists of corporations that existed 100 years ago, some of them, many of them are no longer around. So survival is an important goal. So I feel public relations people should address themselves to these goals, these strategic considerations of a corporation. In saying that, and I'm sure that another speaker, Ed Downs, will mention the term, in this way you can qualify yourself as a member of the, quote, dominant coalition. That's a phrase that Ed Downs loves.
Yes.
And it's used in the PR literature, and all it really means, dominant coalition. You're a member of the top management group. You sit down with the president and senior VPs and other VPs, and maybe you yourself are a VP, and you make a contribution. Well, now this also means if you're going to make a contribution, it's not only to say, well, now you've made a decision, and here is how you might communicate it. I'd like to feel that a PR person says, here are matters you should consider in making your decision. And typically speaking, the resource, the strength that a PR person has is they know more or should know more about public opinion than anybody in the organization. Now, they get this information partially from public opinion surveys. They would be on top of all the public opinion surveys that pertain to their industry or their type of organization. And then secondly, when you look at the background of public relations, a lot of former journalists crossed over to become public relations people. The pay was a little bit better, salaries were better, and they also felt they had more status. Well, if you look at a journalist, most of them talk about having a beat. you know, it's not like beating your wife, they have a beat, an area that they know very well. And they know people in it, and they interview them, and then they write stories about them. Well, PR people also have their beats, and it's not only the local community, it may be within the nation, it may be within the world. Certainly groups of people that they are in contact with, and that they know their thinking. And therefore, in being a member of a dominant coalition, they can make a contribution. And in making a contribution, all managers on the top, they are really very worried. They are worried about vulnerability to their corporate reputation. They're concerned about uncertainties in the environment. Okay, economists take care of that. But uncertainties with regard to what's going on in the country. And so PR people ought to be in touch with people in their beat, and these are usually opinion leaders. And opinion leaders, they, of course, are ones who pay attention to the media, pay attention to what people are saying. So this is what qualifies a PR person to also be a member of management and to say that public relations is a management function. And then we can go on and talk about strategic communications between organizations and their publics. Now, another little complaint that I have, and I've already hinted at it, because I paused at the word publics. Sure, it's used, and the PR books use it, and in some ways, I like the word publics because it reminds us of our relationship to public opinion. And so we say, instead of being concerned about the opinion of the entire country or large groups of people, we're also interested in the opinions of groups of people. And these groups are publics. Now, in a more organized fashion, and I see I'm equipped to put you on board, we talk about stakeholders, and I tried, thank you, boy, that's service. And then we like to sort of say, what's a picture of PR? And the picture that's the most popular is called the wheel picture. And the wheel simply means you put the organization in the middle, and that could be a government agency, it could be a nonprofit organization, it could be a corporation. And typically, I refer to multinational corporations because they are so important. And as Don Wright, who will be a speaker, told his class recently, if you look at 100 largest economies in the world, now economies, you mean what's the GNP, the gross national product. And if you look at what's the gross national product of 100 entities, they could be countries or they could be multinational corporations. 51 of them are multinational corporations, which tells you the enormous power that multinationals have in the world. Enormous power. So I tend to not just refer to business or a corporation, but multinational corporation. So anyhow, this might be a multinational corporation, it could be a government, it could be a nonprofit organization. In mentioning nonprofit organizations, also that would include non-governmental organizations, but I'll say a little bit more about this soon. Now, the first layer, the first circle around it, you're dealing with, and I'll not use the word publics, but use the word stakeholders. And that's the word you'll find in management books. Stakeholder, like the definition is the same as with a public. Any group that is either affected by what you do, or you might affect it, is a public or a stakeholder group. Now, it includes, and here you have a lot of differences. I like to include here some of the major factors of production, because if we're talking about a multinational corporation, and that's the example I'll use over here, multinational corporation. You talk about Any economists in here? Anybody who's taken economics? Remember the term factors of production? And no, this is a little economics course. Factors of production are, first of all, you have to have capital. And I'll show that by putting a dollar sign there. You need money. Capital is represented by a field called investor relations. That's my abbreviation for relations, RELS. So capital is provided by investors. And the field is called investor relations. And these are stockholders of the organization. They may be major investment companies. And therefore, they get, I mentioned them first. Most corporations are started with people investing money. That's why I put them first. Then secondly, you need employees, right? And so, put down, my abbreviation for employees is EES, employees. And that I should really do this first, that's over there, put down, they provide labor. And it's employees and employee relations. Okay, then typically also as a factor of production, economists always mention land. You know, where you're going to put your building, where you're going to put your factory, where you're going to get your resources. And so land is important. Now sometimes raw land. As a matter of fact, land has become so scarce in the world that some countries in the world, and I think Saudi Arabia is one of them, South Korea is another one, they are buying land in Africa because land is available and land is not used very economically. So these countries, and I think Japan is another one, they feel they can go to Africa, buy land, and then import fertilizer, use some equipment instead of manpower, and get more productivity out of the land. So this, I'm saying this in recognition of the importance of land. Now, as a little personal comment, one of the problems with this is that people in Africa who worked on that land are thrown away. See, maybe some companies would say, well, let's hire them. That would be a good move. But if they're just put aside and say, well, now we're going to be more productive, but you go away and find a job somewhere else, or some piece of land that it maybe is not as valuable. So we have land, and I think here, I would say this represents the field of community relations. So I'm saying that the three major stakeholders from the viewpoint of a corporation, investors, employees, and community. And the factors of production, capital, labor, and land. So you look at any public relations book, and they will always mention these stakeholders, the key stakeholders. Now there are others, like government, they control, they regulate what corporations do, but these are the major ones. Okay, then another circle around here, you'll find that books say, aside from the stakeholders and dealing with them, and I want to point out that every one of these publics or stakeholders, there are courses offered in a lot of public relations curriculum. In fact, at BU, at one point at least, we had a course called Investor Relations, and you know all about human resources and organizational communication, and community relations. We had somebody teaching that. So these were full-fledged courses. There was so much to say about it. One further comment with land. Companies are not only interested in the raw land, but they will locate in a place where there are various supportive facilities. They'll ask, is water there? Not just to use for manufacturing or for drinking. Is there a seaport? Is there a river for transportation? Is there, are there roads? So we can import supplies and export what we produce. So that is called, and I'll just put a little footnote here. We have to be aware that there's such a thing as infrastructure. Infrastructure. Now that's a word that's more and more used because countries throughout the world are discovering, developing countries, I should say, are discovering that they have very inadequate infrastructures. When people write about India, they'll say, look, the roads are so bad. We can't transport our goods. Same thing in Africa. So the World Bank will give priority to infrastructure projects in Africa and in India and other parts of the world, because that is a necessary component of moving into a particular community. So infrastructure, a major concept. I remember reading about, I think it was Cadbury, British, I think it's British firm rather than Swiss. I associate chocolate with Switzerland.
It is British. Yeah.
It's British. They opened a plant in Nigeria. However, they discovered that they had to drill for their own water because there was no local water supply. And electricity, they had to bring in their own generators because they couldn't depend on electricity provided by the city, or it wouldn't be reliable. You know, if you have production, especially if it's continuous production, you can't have a stoppage. You need reliability. So, in other words, buy your land, but bring your own infrastructure. It's like going camping and making sure you have a lamp and a little refrigerator and whatnot. Infrastructure is also important with regard to certain problems that arise. Nestle's was trying to sell infant formula in Nigeria and Africa. This backfired. It became a major crisis, and you know all about that. And to be very brief, the problem was mainly one of infrastructure. There wasn't pure water. There wasn't refrigeration. In some cases, there wasn't even enough fuel for a fire to warm up the formula. And then other aspects, and sometimes this is included under infrastructure, the economics weren't good enough for households. They didn't have enough money to buy expensive infant formula. And so they diluted, the mothers diluted it, and that can kill a baby. So anyway, no more on that. So this next layer here, it's typically called the socio-political environment. Now, socio-political, you run across that term an awful lot, and as a matter of fact, it describes the field of public affairs. Now, PR people say public affairs is a part of what we do, and it is. On the other hand, there's a separate Public Affairs Council in Washington, D.C. And they define their craft as we deal with the socio-political environment. Okay, now later on I'll add something to that. So that then is the field of, I'll put down over here, public affairs. Okay, and we can claim public affairs, although I find a lot of PR people, they break it down into governmental relations, or they'll say, you mentioned this recently, or they deal with advocacy groups. See, at first, I think it was back in the 60s in the United States, governments began to regulate business more. There was one regulation after another. The curve just went up. And so they had to start governmental relations. You know, that became part of PR. Then the lawyers got a little jealous and they said, hey, we think we'll take over that function. And so sometimes the lawyers got into the act. And then in the 70s, you had the so-called third sector. Now that's a little phrase used to refer to many organizations in, and I'll use another little term here, civil society. Now that's a term used more in international relations, but civil society means, well, what is not government, what is not business, is civil society. You know, it's that simple. And so a lot of these groups in civil society grew up, and one of their jobs was not like the typical nonprofit organization, which was more or less providing social services and health services to the community. Take care of some of the social needs of people. That was the function of the original NPOs. Or they were concerned with religion, morality, stuff like that. Now, there was this new kind, and that was called the third sector by some. They were interested in putting pressure on corporations to do the right thing. In effect, they were saying, you corporate people are so focused on making a profit that you forget about what we in PR call social responsibility. So we're going to keep the pressure on. If you don't treat women right, there's a women's group that's going to put pressure on you. If you are soiling the environment, if you don't pay enough attention to social costs, we've got environmental groups to take care of that. And so pressure, pressure, pressure. And these business people went absolutely crazy. One pressure after another. Burson Marsteller did something rather original. They wanted to introduce their CEOs, the clients of major corporations, to this new world of the advocates and these pressure groups. And so they invited a bunch of these activists to a luncheon meeting. And these activists were told, now, you give them a little flavor of what it's like when you go out there and you protest. And so there was a guy from an NPO sitting there, looking very innocent. And when he'd get up, they used a lot of foul language. And the executives, you should have seen them. They said, oh, you know, as if an arrow pierced their hearts. They were suddenly, they were angry, but it brought them into this new world of these activist groups and what they had to contend with. And so public affairs had included both government relations and also relations with these advocacy groups. And that's this particular realm. Now then, this semester I'm teaching a course in international public relations. And I thought, well, I've got to have another circle here, you know, if I'm going to remain in academic work. And so I drew another circle over here. And here, from an international perspective, on the one hand, I could say, look, any multinational corporation that has a factory or an office in any country, they will exercise these various functions as they do domestically, except they have to consider other factors. And these other factors are, again, there are different political systems, also different social systems, and most importantly, and that's what's usually stressed, different cultures. Different cultures. That's what is usually emphasized in international management books. There are more books out on intercultural communications and the importance of culture in doing business when you go somewhere than probably anything else. Just out of curiosity, I was interested in how the culture of Saudi Arabia was defined. And as a shortcut to culture, one of the important figures is a person named Hofstede. I think his name is Gerd Hofstede. He mentioned, he said you could probably describe cultures through several dimensions. And at first he just had a few dimensions, so let me mention what they are. One of them is power distance. Now, power distance is kind of a jargon. And it simply means how comfortable are people with people who are in power. Do they oppose them, or are they willingly obedient, willingly accept somebody in a higher state? And so in Saudi Arabia, boy, this is small print, the dimension deals with the fact that all individual societies are not equal. It expresses the attitude of culture toward these inequalities amongst us. Power distance is defined as the extent to which the less powerful members of institutions and organizations within a country expect and accept that power is distributed equally. One of the attributes of Saudi Arabia is it has high power distance rating, which means there's greater acceptance of this inequality. They don't try to fight those on the top. They're more willing to say, okay, this is the way it is. Okay, so that's power distance. And then another one, individualism versus collectivism. Now there, in this particular chart, individualism is ranked very, very low. Now individualism simply means you're more competitive. These are the business people. These are the American business people. They want to make money. They'll engage in cutthroat competition with others. Whereas the Saudis, they're more likely to be like the Japanese and some Asian cultures, collectivist. Now maybe, it's the background. As somebody told me in Bahrain, my grandfather, he was still out in the desert living in a tent. Now when you have less room to move around in, you're inclined to be more collectivist. You can't have as much space. This is another dimension not involved here, but I was also interested in social space, private space. And there are various charts, and Edward T. Hall, he's a well-known writer in cultural works, he says there's intimate space. You leave that for family members and for your husbands and wives and lovers. And then there's private space. You're willing to allow maybe, with intimate space, there's no space. But with private space, maybe 18 inches. That's okay. Private space, it's still, you are not being invaded by others. And then you move over to public space. Now, one thing I noticed, and I'm not sure I remember this right, I had a class where I was talking about this, and there was a student standing up front, and I went very close to her. Now, I have to be careful here. Very, very close. I invaded her private space. Well, she can't move now, but this person backed up, and the class saw that. I said, there's an example. I've invaded her private space, and she can't take it. And then I was told that the Saudis, they can put up with closer distances, even in private space. I'm not sure if this is right. I haven't been able to check up on it.
You can ask them.
Well, I can ask you. Well, I won't ask a woman. I'll ask a man. Yeah? How close can a person get to you, a stranger, and you wouldn't feel uncomfortable?
It depends. First of all, usually maybe 15 centimeters.
How many feet? Meters. You do putting in meters.
Like half a meter.
Half a meter. Okay.
At least.
Yeah. Half a meter. A meter is what, 39 inches or something like that?
No.
And so half of that,
Like 35.
35 inches. Oh, okay. 35
Now,
inches.
if you go outside the airport, inside Saudi Arabia, the airport, you will see many problems when they different seats and they want to change.
Okay. There are. Anyhow, look. I don't want to belabor this point. In Saudi Arabia, private space is people are sensitive to getting a little closer, whereas I think in Britain certainly, where there's greater formality, I need a little space. You're much too close to me. Who you think you are? That kind of attitude on their faces. Now then, masculinity versus femininity is talked about by Hofstede. And masculinity simply, or let's look at femininity. There's a tendency to be more concerned with social matters, with how people feel. Whereas masculinity, that's more making money. Making money. Okay, and then another area where Saudi Arabia is high on uncertainty avoidance. You don't want to do things that make you feel uncomfortable because you're not sure what's going to happen. Another way to put it, there's a desire for more rules in living. And of course, if you look at the Muslim religion, Sharia law, and all kinds of rules, it makes people feel comfortable. Same thing is true with Germans. I was in Berlin last summer and Siemens, and boy, they love rules. You know, there's no question about what people are going to do. You do it or you don't do it. Not like the word we use in the United States, guidelines. You know, we'll give you a guideline, and then you may exceed the guideline. So anyhow, these are ways in which countries are described, and Hofstede's cultural factors are the main ones. So this I would call more the international realm, and that then is what you pay attention to if you move overseas. Okay, now that gives you the picture of PR. In the chapter, notice that I describe 5 major factors that are involved in international PR, and one of them is players. Now, I'm using the word players instead of the word stakeholders or instead of the word publics. And players, that's the word that they seem to use in international relations. The diplomats, they all talk about players. Well, okay. So we have to know what the players are, and you would want to be introduced to not only the multinationals, not only nonprofit organizations, but now we're saying you have to know something about supranatural organizations. Supernatural. And these, the main one that should come to mind is United Nations. There are a lot of other international organizations, and you read about them in the newspaper all the time. International Monetary Fund, I mentioned the World Bank, International Labor Organization, a lot of these organizations that have been formed. And these are ones that domestically, if a corporation is totally domestic, you don't deal with them. So that's another layer that is included under the political system. And then, of course, you deal not only with your own country, but you deal with nations from all over the world, nation states. It seems that people studying diplomacy, they like that term, nation state, better than country. So if you want to sound sophisticated like a diplomat, you don't refer to England, but the nation state of Great Britain. You know, then you're one of them. You're one of them. You're using their language. So we have to learn something about these nation states, and just as we study what's true in our country, whatever country you're from, you get to know what the various organizations are within that particular country where you have a subsidiary or where you're doing some kind of business. Okay, then issues. Issues management is a major aspect of public relations. Because when you talk about relations with stakeholders, relations with outsiders in the community, relations with nation states, well, what do you talk about? You don't talk about the weather, except to start conversation rolling. You talk about issues. What are the problems that we face with each other? Contentious issues, usually where there isn't complete agreement and where you have to negotiate and come to some sort of agreement. So issues management is very, very important. And in the chapter, I'm pretty sure I have a whole list of these issues. They are growing resistance to globalization, fight against poverty, human rights, and so forth. Incidentally, in today's Wall Street Journal, I saw a new kind of ad. Now this is, I call it an advocacy ad, because I've never come across this term before. Energy poverty? You know, we hear about poverty, people not having enough money for food and whatnot, but now, who do you think it is? It's not an oil company. It's the Peabody, a campaign by Peabody. They are coal, they're miners. They find that coal is being attacked again and again and again as being environmentally poor, and so they started a campaign. And it sort of struck me. Energy poverty, I don't really like the term. I think using energy in connection with poverty doesn't mix in my mind. But anyhow, maybe I have to get used to it. And maybe Peabody wants people to get used to it, because poverty is an accepted term. We're all against poverty. And so now maybe we can all be against energy poverty and be supportive of the coal industry. You know, that's the PR theme that's used. And this grew out of issues management, probably. And that's why I brought it in, just today's paper. Okay, and also one of the subjects, another issue is, I called it anger in Islam. And of all the religions, I thought that in the United States and in Western Europe, more attention should be given to Islam, because people don't know enough about it. And so for years now, I've been talking about Islam in my classes, and then also introducing some cases. And the main case, and many of you are familiar with that, the Danish cartoon case, where an artist, a cartoonist in a Danish newspaper, was insulting to Muhammad. I mean, it's really, I find it despicable, actually, for a cartoonist to do this to any religion. It's like Warhol. I think he had a portrait of Jesus Christ and somebody urinating on his figure. That's not right. That's not respectful. Somebody shouldn't take license. And the editor of the newspaper said, well, we believe in freedom of the press. You know, we're now getting into those values. Okay, but you may have freedom of the press, but people who have freedom, they ought to exercise some social responsibility. They ought to constrain themselves a little bit. And then what made matters worse is the Muslims in Denmark, they objected. They went to the editor, complained about it. He didn't do anything. They went to Rasmussen, the prime minister, with a petition. He didn't even reply to a letter. What kind of insult is that? You know, not replying to an earnest letter saying we feel offended. And so now this is PR again, in terms of public affairs. What do? You're in a country, the Muslims in your country have been insulted. The editors, the media, and the government are not responding. So you're still going to take action. Now, it doesn't take too much of a jump to think, well, we're going to take this issue to the Middle East. And that's exactly what they did. In the Middle East, they declared a boycott of Danish products. And that included the dairy company. And so then they suffered. Dairy company began to put pressure on the Danish government. Well, what did the prime minister do? He simply said, well, we're sorry, and I don't have time to get into the various forms of an apology, or what constitutes a sincere apology. It was not a sincere apology. What he in effect said was, I'm sorry this was done, and sorry you feel that way about it. In other words, you're something wrong with you. Why are you feeling this way about it? I apologize if you feel that way about it. And then the dairy company thought, we'll repeat this ad because it looks good, it sounds like an apology, and apology is sort of a magic word, it removes all the problems. That didn't work. Then finally, other ads appeared, and the boycott began to have more and more of an effect. And finally, Rasmussen came around and he apologized. But again, only by saying, we're sorry you feel that way. What really solved the problem was, PR people know you don't always solve problems through the media or through advocacy, advertising. You solve problems by meeting with people. And so they met with Muslim leaders and had a discussion with them. And as a result of that discussion, they came to an agreement. Boycott was over, and it was so advertised. So now this is the kind of case study that we take up in the context of the importance of religions in PR and how Islam might create.
On this point, I remember I worked for the Parliament of Saudi Arabia. I remember the ambassador of Denmark came to meet the president of the Shura Council of the Parliament, and he say, "I'm sorry" in person. So and the next day we wrote a press release and we sent it to the newspapers. The ambassador of Denmark, he say, "I'm sorry," and all the newspapers published the news. After that, he said, "I didn't say I'm sorry as ambassador of Denmark or like the Denmark opinion. I say it as because I have a good relationship with the Parliament of Saudi Arabia, and they sent a press release. They say we didn't say sorry." So I remember he didn't say sorry. He said sorry in person, but when we published this in news, he sent a press release. And I mean the embassy of Denmark, they sent a press release to say we didn't say sorry. As a Denmark, the country, he just the ambassador says sorry.
Okay, there's so much, what constitutes an apology? I don't have the reference right now, but there was a marvelous article in the Harvard Business Review on apologies. What's needed for a sincere apology? One of them is, first of all, acknowledgement of your wrongdoing. Now, did the Danish government ever really do that?
No.
Acknowledge that we did something wrong? Now they hedge you.
Actually, we record. I was the guy who wrote the news.
Yeah.
So I remember we have record. So we record. He say this was not okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry about that. We wrote what he exact said, but when we published it, I don't know if they called them. Denmark or something. But I remember we have the recorder, and when he say no, we didn't. We take the recorder to the president of the Shura Council and we listen for it. So I remember the word he said.
So you were satisfied, though, at the end in ending the boycott.
Yeah.
You were agreeable to that, ending the boycott. Okay, because it was also hurting the Middle East. Wonderful dairy products that they weren't reached. Yeah.
To be honest, it's not, our problem wasn't with the company, of the Danish, the Danish companies. The problem was with the newspaper, or with the media policies over there. So that was the point. If we will be satisfied of stopping the boycott, it will not be because we are forgiving the newspaper, but we are forgiving the companies who are not involved in this issue.
Okay, of course, the newspapers didn't print the apology on their own. They were paid for by Danish companies.
Yes.
There's another aspect to this. I don't want to drag this on too long. But in class, one of my students asked, well, is it all right for other companies then to take advantage of the situation that this Danish company is in, or isn't it? And well, what actually happened, a lot of the other companies said, we are not Danish. It reminds me of Germany. We're not Nazis. We never were Nazis.
I remember we have we get text messages. This is the Danish companies. You should just stop by these stuff.
That's a mixed message, and that's one of the rules that PR people object to. be clear about your message. Don't send out mixed messages. It mixes people up. They don't know what to do. Now, admittedly, I tend to look at international public relations as a form of diplomacy. And some companies are calling themselves diplomats. In fact, I asked Jim Maracas, he headed up ExxonMobil's international public affairs team of over 100 people. And I said, well, Jim, why don't you say that you're a diplomat? He said, look, between you and me, Otto, we think we are diplomats, but we don't want to tell anybody because they'll be angry at us. The State Department will be angry at us. We're interfering with their bailiwick. And so, don't use the term. But there are, and I mentioned it in the chapter, there are some books that have appeared with the term corporate diplomacy.
Right.
So anyhow,
Right.
What I want to say about diplomacy, one of the rules of diplomatic communication is you deliberately say things that are ambiguous. Because then if there's a certain interpretation, well, that's not what I meant. You can back your way out of this. And there are other, I guess I don't have them in this chapter, but diplomats can tell you to go to hell in such a beautiful way that you look forward to going there. That's the real definition of public diplomacy. Okay, let me, I think I've hit some of the major points that I wanted to make. The various players, the cultural realm there, the issues, corporate governance. I mentioned at the very beginning that if we're going to be members of the dominant coalition, we better play a role in corporate governance and know something about it. And corporate governance, of course, deals with how, that's the top layer in the corporation. They determine what's going to be done, who's going to be hired, how much profit is sought, and so forth. Then there's a section on social responsibility. Almost always public relations people like to talk about social responsibility. In fact, students in my class just refer to CSR. No, corporate social responsibility. Everybody's supposed to know what CSR means. And there are various definitions. The one case that has been of great interest to me within the last couple of months is the case of the apparel industry in Bangladesh. The apparel industry. American and European firms, garment firms, are sending more and more work to Bangladesh because they have a lot of factories there, they have a lot of workers there, and they pay very little. At the time when a crisis occurred, the salary was, and I'm deliberately being vague here, $38. $38, what, a week? No, a month. $38 a month. And although Gap is on my hit list,
Yeah.
they put out a beautiful statement, a code of vendor relations. It's a model. Everything that a company should do is stated in that code. And then at the end, I sort of said to myself, and they do nothing. Because in Bangladesh, what happened? They simply have a contract with a vendor, and just say, oh yeah, we're going to have some inspection, some supervision over it, but they don't pay for it. If somebody comes along and checks, oh, you have this, that, yeah, okay, you pass. The day when the accident occurred, about over 1,100 people died. Workers were about to enter the building. They saw a crack in the building. And they said, look, this is dangerous. And the owner and the manager said, don't worry. This building is going to last another 100 years. That day or the next day, the building collapsed. Yeah, they were lying. They were lying. And certainly Gap and the other companies, they were not really supervising the inspectors. And so these awful things happened. Also that building, it was designed to be 5 stories high. And part of it was built on a pond. Now, you know ponds. The soil is not exactly that solid. Then the owner thought, gosh, there's so many people who want to have factories. Let's build another 3 floors. And so although the engineers said you can't really do that, well, the owner got together with the politicians in Dhaka, and they said, okay, we'll allow you to build 3 more stories. Well, 3 more stories over 5. And you know, there are people there, there are machinery there. It's just so irresponsible. So irresponsible that I just really get angry when I think of social responsibility. And Gap putting out this beautiful, beautiful statement, and it's a bunch of lies. One thing though, I've changed my mind slightly, I've moved a little closer toward Gap, because they made a statement that they approve of a $10 minimum wage starting in another year. Now this is a personal opinion, you know, I'm breaking my own rule, I usually don't get into politics, but I thought this is a nice gesture to make. And they made that gesture without consulting Walmart, which is another one of these companies that victimizes people. So with social responsibility, that's the case that I would now refer to. Okay, there's a section of the organizational culture. Just as we talk about culture in nations, we can talk about cultures within a company or within any organization. And of course, we want to look at their code of ethics. That's one of the main topics. Okay, let's see if there's anything else. I don't think I have to describe communications because you get so much of this in other courses. I do refer to the fact that there's such a thing as black journalism. You know, that's, you have to be aware of that when you go see. And again, mentioning ExxonMobil, Jim Maracas, when he was assigned to Athens, the very first day he was on the job, an editor from one of the Athens newspapers comes to him and says, you know, we've got a whole bunch of stories about you, about your company. You wouldn't look very good if these were published. However, you know the rest. Corruption, more or less blackmail, that's what it amounts to. And Jim Maracas, so he said, we don't play that game. We don't play that game. And so, okay, next day, newspaper came out with a terrible article about Exxon. But that went by. That went by. He stood his ground. And that's what a code of ethics really means. And that put a stop to that form of black journalism as it applied to them. Where there's more frequent mention to black journalism is a lot of countries have insult laws. You're not allowed to insult the leaders of a nation. And on one hand, it's understandable because it produces social instability, but in most cases, they go too far. They go too far, where there can't be any dissent, anybody who has an opinion that is different from the official opinion. I know this is a controversial statement, but anyhow, that's one of the problems that is faced. Okay, so that is, I think, an overview of my chapter. I just wanted to hit major points. And again, to summarize, I'm a strong believer that public relations is a profession that's going to remain forever. And that's because people's opinions are important. And public relations is really based on the feelings that people have. And PR people, I warn my students, don't think of public relations as only dealing with giving out information. Remember the hierarchy of effects. And that is that, yes, you can use mass media, for example, advertising, to attract attention to some issue or some product or something. And then secondly, you might provide more information about that particular issue. But then third, you've got to be concerned about what are the, and in this hierarchy of effects, the next layer is attitudes. Are you affecting attitudes? We're not just giving out information. We're trying to persuade. Maybe that's the word I should use. We are trying to persuade people. And then attitudes are fine. But you know, attitudes, it's like a little locker in a railroad station. You put your baggage in there, but you've got to take it a step further. Attitudes then have to translate into behavior. And I think PR ought to be focused on behavior as the ultimate objective of what we do. And that behavior is not only on the part of the publics, the stakeholders, the audiences we try to reach, but also, and I still remember when we had an Air Force class at BU, and they said, Dr. Lerbinger, you're always talking about attitude change. What about changing but the attitudes of people there, audiences, what about them up there? Can we change their attitudes? Our bosses. And so that's why I end up saying we also ought to try to be members of the dominant coalition and try to have an influence on the thinking of top managers. And in the long run, there are so many articles that are appearing saying the kind of thinking that a lot of corporations are engaged in today is becoming more and more archaic, more and more obsolete, more and more dysfunctional. They have to change. And there are many reasons I don't want to get into, but just to mention one, sustainability. There's so many issues that are there. Corporations can't go on acting the way they have always acted. They have to change the way they do business, and I hope it happens with companies like Gap. Okay, that's end of presentation. Any questions?
Does anybody have any questions for Dr. Lerbinger? Or do you want to make any comments about what he said about Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, about public relations, as my undergrad was about public relations, and I worked for the government as public relations or PR person. I believe, I just think the PR department or people just to protect the CIO or the organization. They see them as to protect themselves when they have any problem. They didn't give them any benefits to share them their issue, or when they have a crisis, they just want them to fix it. So that's what I believe. So always also for the public relation people, always do your problem. Any problem happened in the organization, when they deal with their or the public, or they deal the department with each other, the structure of the organization, they always the problem, you have to handle the problem. You have to be responsible for the problem.
Okay, if I understand you right, in other words, the function of PR is not to make policy. The function of PR is to communicate the policy. You're executing. You're executing. It's one. There's a model that's used in PR: one-way communication and two-way communication. This sounds like one-way communication, and there's another word, symmetrical. You're doing this for the benefit of your bosses and your organization. You're not thinking about how it's going to affect the stakeholders. So that's somewhat primitive, elementary level of public relations practice, in my opinion.
Well, that's their attitude towards you, right?
Yeah, that's their attitude. Oh,
Yeah, Aziz says public relations to the Parliament of
Yeah,
Saudi
I
Arabia,
know.
that's good.
This
And
is-
then you're just told to send out the message that they want sent out.
Yeah,
To fix the
I have
problem,
that
they're not
example.
looking at it as building relationships
Yeah.
with various public, they're not looking at it the way Professor Lerbinger described in this chapter, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I have an example. They go with delegations to visit or attend any conference. We responsible for make the schedule for them. So I remember one time they have free time. The delegation. So the president of the Shore Council, he said, I will go with the members of the Shore Council, and they asked to go. I think 7 or 6 or whatever the time. So the president stayed in his suite more than the time to the time of the bus. So the members, they downstairs in the lobby, they angry where is he. So when we go to him, he said, don't go, I will go, I will come. When he came, he just turned to the guys who, me and my boss, he said, why didn't you tell me if they are downstairs? So we had to handle the problem. It was our problem. We didn't tell him.
Right.
Actually, we talked.
I think Ed Downs is going to be very interested in
Yeah,
this.
and I think he's going to be interested in Ed
Yeah,
John's
because
presentation.
he's interested in legislative media relations.
Yeah, and government
And I think
relations.
it's more likely for it to be one way in that particular situation. rather than the
It
corporate.
comes to your point when you said like the power in Saudi Arabia, like always we
Yeah.
for position or like money or like name or family name.
Yeah,
So always the power comes first.
yeah. Well, thanks for your comment. Any question back there?
Yeah, I mean, I'm from Bangladesh, just to defend Gap and Walmart and to
Oh, you're going to defend Gap?
to some extent. I don't know if I can rationalize
Okay,
it
let's
at all.
have it out.
Yeah, the thing is, when Gap, Walmart deal with the garments factories, the protocols are quite maintained, but those garment factories owners again outsource the work. And once they outsource to smaller companies, those companies doesn't maintain the protocols. And they are not, Gap is not abided by to follow with the other companies that are outsourced to. So there's the loophole that they have created. It's more, I should say, our garments owners' fault that they shouldn't be doing. Because in terms of legality, Gap has, I mean, they cannot, what should I say, feed or pampered to that extent that the outsourced companies should also be maintaining protocols. Gap cannot maintain that. They are maintaining with the parent garments company, who are getting an outsourcing to the companies who are not maintaining the protocols at all. And those are loopholes that the garments owner are taking advantage of. Most of them are. I mean, the owner, as you said quite rightly and aptly, that he's actually a current ruling party's one of the very good allies, almost literally a third, basically. So,
Well, you know, companies like the Gap, they were the prize companies when the subject, well, when the globalization movement first occurred.
yeah.
Tom Friedman, his book, The World is Flat,
Mhm.
will look at companies like the Gap and say, well, look, production was cheaper. It's cheaper in these countries. And we're helping them. I mean, Bangladesh is very thankful for this business because their gross domestic product has grown. Women, even though they're earning very little, they had a choice. Stay back in the farm or go into the city. Well, maybe some of them regretted going to the city, but anyhow, things were awful back in the farm. And so they felt there was an improvement. But now the big question is, shouldn't companies change their way of doing business there? And they are. They have agreed on, I think it's an $85 a month minimum wage, which is still lower than the competitor in China. That's the main producer of apparel. But higher, I think, than Cambodia, some of these other
I mean,
Asian countries.
after this crisis, it was almost 4 of the incidents, and this one almost 2,800 died, the Sabah incident. In 1 year, it would be total amount 5,000 workers died just because of this building collapse and stuff, which is very, what should I say, not.
Well, you know, I would just hope for this, even though I've been very down on Gap, I still am primarily. But when these events, one other thing I want to say, I thought that when over 1,000 people died, that maybe there would be some reaction, because I still remember talking to some journalist who was stationed in Paris, and he said, you know, for us to write a story about one Frenchman dying, we will write a story if one Frenchman gets killed. We will write a story about an American being killed if there are 5 Americans that get killed. In other words, we need a greater, higher threshold. But we need 15 Algerians that get killed before it's worthy of a story. And so I thought, well, maybe with 1,000 Bangladeshi women dying, maybe that's worthy of a story. And it was.
And how? I mean, they were almost forced to
Organized.
be inside the building that day, as you rightly said. I mean, they said the building is cracked, but they were almost forced to work that day. And it was that day that the building collapsed. So I think the bottleneck is more, garments owners should be enforced by the government. Government is actually exploiting the situation on its own. If you don't, if legislations and government doesn't enforce these issues to the garments owners, the disparity of rich and poor is everywhere. But it's how you nullify it, how you minimize it, That's not working.
Right, well, that's another subject.
Totally, yeah.
Government is not helping the situation much.
Absolutely.
In fact, I don't know if you've heard about political risk assessment. If companies go into a country, they make a political risk assessment, and they would say, well, in terms of opportunity, wonderful, low cost. But in terms of the risks, with that kind of a government,
Yeah.
not sticking up for employee rights, not supervising the engineering of business, that's a danger, a risk. And so I could understand some companies simply saying, we don't want to have anything to do with any of this, but it's too attractive. $38 a month. Gosh, I have to pay that much to have my lawn, the ice removed from my front lawn. $38. So anyhow, I think in the long run, little by little, these companies have pressure on them, and they are going to change because their reputation is at stake.
Yeah.
And when their reputation, their brand, their company brand suffers, then they see the dawn. And they say, okay, we're going to do something about it. It'll take a while,
Yeah.
but it's slowly happening.
Exactly. I mean, $2.3 billion has been lost, I think, after that. So, I mean, the government owners are seeing the repercussions as well. That they cannot keep on happening. So you're right.
Okay, we'll see what happens in the long run. Okay, any other question, or what should we do now? It's a quarter after. There's a case in the book.
There is a case in the book. Thank you so much.
Well, you're
First of
most
all.
welcome. You're most
You've
welcome.
given everyone a lot to think about. Very comprehensive. You've covered so many angles related to public relations. So the case that